All right, so let's talk about credit card lates. I know we talked about this a little bit on the previous videos, talking about some of the bad feedback, how consumer scores look at late payments on a credit card differently than the FICO Classic scores. But we're on the subject of credit cards, and I want to really cover the subject of credit cards and utilization. So here we go. Late payments on a credit card, even just a 30-day late. I don't care if you've paid that thing perfect for the last 10 years. The FICO Classic algorithms, like we talked about, treat codes all derogatory the same, and that late payment is devastating to a score and can take months, if not sometimes years, to fully recover. The consumer scores, again, doesn't give the same feedback. It might hit you 15 points and show a full recovery within 90 days, sometimes sooner. But this is not accurate. So important with your credit card balances that, your credit card payments, that they're at least paid on time. Yeah, we want to pay the balances down, but if things get tight, at least cover the minimum payment. Your scores might still be, dropped because your balances were too high. Maybe you weren't able to get them down that month, but but your history's good. And the next month, get the thing paid down or start working away on it. Just don't be late, and do not listen to the feedback that you're getting that it's not a real big deal that you were 30 days late. It is a big deal, and it could cost you a ton of points. I can't count to you how many folks that we run into every day that have relatively good credit sprinkled with lates, and it's costing them a home. Which leads to this. I've heard this, so I'm going to debunk this. I've heard it many, many times. I think that based on some of the newer algorithms, this is going to be more relative. However, when it comes to the FICO Classic scores, it's not, and it hasn't been, and that is balance history. The idea that if you've ever maxed out a credit card, that, let's say I maxed out this credit card 4 months ago, but since then and currently my balances are down and my utilization's good, but since it was maxed out 4 years ago, that limit is recorded on there, that high limit, and that's affecting my score. If it is so minimal that it's hard to notice, all right? So it's very minimal. Now, having said that, that does seem to be a factor on the consumer scores, and that's rumored to be a factor on the new FICO 10T scores, which we're currently studying that could someday become the new mortgage score. Again, different subject. Well, of course, they, again, have been trying to change and retire the FICO Classic scores for some years now. So, obviously avoid maxing out a card, period, right? But if you did and it happens, you're not doomed in the fact that you can't recover as soon as you get the balance down, because you will, or at least as soon as that reports during that cycle. Reporting cycles. When's the right time to pay the credit card? I see this all the time as well, where folks will use their cards throughout the month, and they're real good about paying them off, but they use them steadily. Maybe they're trying to collect some of these points and air miles, whatever, right? So they use their credit card to pay everything, and then when the bill comes in, they pay it off, or they'll max it out halfway through the month, and then they'll pay it back down. And I've seen this so many times to where, we pull their credit up and the credit cards are maxed, or the balances on them are very high. And they say, no, I paid that thing down. Well, you got to time it right. Because if you pay that credit card, let's say that you paid the payment due date on that card wasn't till, May the 15th. And you paid it off May the 7th. Yeah, your payment's on time. However, if you use that card between the 7th and the 15th on into its report date, it's going to record the balance on that statement. That statement's going to readjust whatever that balance is. That's what's populating to your credit score. Now, there's certain cards out there that don't do that, but the vast majority of them do. So whatever the balance it is that day that it reports, that's what's populating on your credit score. How do you know what day it reports to your credit? Well, typically, but this is not always. Typically, it's within 5 days of the payment due date on that credit card. that's the balance that's going to populate to the credit reports. But if you want to know for sure, look at your consumer bureaus like your Credit Karma or your Experian app, and look at the reported date. It'll tell you the exact day that it reported the previous month, or at least the last time that it updated, right? And usually that day is a pretty good indication of when it populated that balance. Now, a lot of us think that that's also the exact same day that it hit your credit. That's not necessarily true. That's the report date. That's the balance that was reported to the credit bureaus, and it might still be 2 or 3 days after that before it actually shows up on your credit. But that report date, if you want to know for sure what does my balance need to be, at that time that I want it to show on the credit, look to that report date, again, usually about 5 days from the payment due date. And again, just use that as a guide. I would always say, hey, a few days before that or a few days after, just don't use the card, and then start using it as normal and rinse and repeat that cycle. Again, so you'll hear a lot of conflicting information around that, but listen, common sense prevails. You can tell based on, again, on that reporting date. Another thing I get asked a lot is, what's the optimum number of credit cards to have? And to answer that, again, it could differ from one file versus another. It could, depending on the age and the mix of accounts that one person might have. But in general, that's 5 to 6 credit cards is optimum. That's a mix of charge cards, that you can only use at the department store, say like a Dillard's card, and of course a major credit card that you can use anywhere. So maybe a couple of charge cards and then 3 major would be a good mix. But I think it's important to realize that a person that has no credit cards, all right, if they add a credit card, that first one, I don't care what the balance is, the limit, that first one alone is probably going to create a 35 to 65 point immediate jump as soon as it reports, assuming that the balance is low like it should be. However, that person 6 months later could add a second credit card, and that second credit card might only give them 5 to 10 points. And sometimes of taking a few months before they see those points manifested. Why? Well, because they're going to get hit with the inquiry, and then it takes a little bit to overcome that, and then they'll see the benefit of that second card. After that, it's pretty minimal, but I do know that after 5 to 6 cards, you start seeing the bureau not like that, and you start losing points. So 5 to 6 is a general answer to that question with a mix of charge cards and major. However, you're going to get the majority of those points from the initial card, and then after that, it's all about the utilization balance versus limits. There's information out there, or maybe we just assume it, that a higher limit credit card's going to jump my credit score. This is not true. It would only jump your credit score if your utilization is bad on the current cards you have, and that higher limit brings down your overall capacity, right? Remember, you got limits versus balances. So if I'm at 75%, there's 2 ways to bring my utilization down or my capacity down. It's either pay them down or raise my limits, right? However, that's when it could help you. It could help a higher limit credit card raise those limits, offsetting your overall utilization. But in the case that your utilization is already good, a higher limit credit card is not going to help you, period. Now, it might still be a good idea to have one because as you have higher limit credit cards, you'll get approved for higher limit credit cards. You'll get approved for maybe some of these better lower interest rate cards or some of these reward cards if you're into that game. But again, that is not a true statement, a blanketed statement anyways. Which leads to this, closed accounts. Well, I heard if you close the account, it'll drop my credit score. It'll drop your Credit Karma score. It'll drop some of your newer consumer scores. And it'll drop your classic scores as well. But again, this is another blanketed statement. If your utilization is already good, then dropping and once you close a current credit card, if your utilization is still optimum, by taking that limit out of the equation, your scores are not going to change. Not on your classic scores. Now, I still don't think it's a good idea, but not from the perspective of, oh, it's going to drop your credit score if you close it, but from the perspective of this, just don't use it. You know, a credit card with a zero balance still populates on-time payments each month, or what we call an on-time payment. What we call an on-time payment is really the status of the account in that particular month. So if you're not using a credit card, but it's still open and it has a zero balance, and you haven't used it for 6 months, it's still going to report each month, and it's going to report the status as current. So using our language that we say on-time payment, you're getting on-time payments for it. And it contributes to the algorithm exactly the same as if you had a balance and you were physically making a payment, right? So for that reason, I wouldn't. Another reason might be because if it's one of my oldest cards, I probably don't want to close that because I'm going to eventually lose that history benefit on that card, especially so after 2 years and sometimes as soon as 6 months. So I could lose the time on the bureau on that card that benefit. But still, it's a question that sometimes we ask ourselves, you know, as we've established our credit and we've got higher limit credit cards, and maybe we have, you know, this 8-10-year-old card with a small balance, and they charge us annual fee, and that annual fee's, you know, pissing us off, and so we just want to close it so I'm not exposed to that. I'm not totally against it as long as my utilization's still good, as long as I got some other cards that I'm not going to suffer by losing some of that time on the bureau on, and I'm not going to let a year or two sway me in that regard. So if that's the case, close it. And if my Credit Karma drops me 30 points, that's a BS drop. It'll be back up in a month, so don't sweat that. But again, consider those factors. Anyways, I hope this blesses you. I think we covered pretty much everything as far as credit cards and the way it relates to the credit bureaus. There is one more thing I do want to talk about. Good gosh, there's all these one more things, right? And that's an authorized user. An authorized user is a great way to add history to your credit, to add utilization, to help offset negative utilization. And that, if you haven't heard of this, they also call it piggybacking. But this is where, in most cases, a family member could add you to one of their credit cards. They don't have to give it to you. In many cases, that history on that account from the day it was opened will transfer onto your credit file. And as long as it's good history and they keep the utilization low, this could be a good thing. Now, you don't want to add multiple authorized users. We have seen if the ratio of authorized users versus your own personal primary card is off, it'll tend to penalize you. So 1 or 2 is optimum. Don't go further than that in relation to, especially if you don't have many of your own credit cards, and I wouldn't even encourage it if you do. Just 1 or 2, maybe higher limit, never been late, if you feel like that'll help offset your utilization, or maybe that history could help you by piggybacking. Certainly if you do have young credit or you have not established utilization yet, hey, an authorized user is a wonderful way to go. It's just today's authorized users don't always report, and maybe they hit one report but they don't hit the other 2. If that's the case, you run into an issue, we got them. I've got a list of grandmas and grandpas that'll add you to their credit card as an authorized user. You won't get the card, but you will get the credit. It'll hit all 3 files. It's perfect history, perfect utilization, high limit cards, and it absolutely will bless a young file. I had a client just yesterday. The client's a 700 credit score. They had their own credit cards, but they were only a few months old. And they also had some installment credit. So they had enough to populate a score, because sometimes it takes a while, but they did. However, the automatic underwriting system with the mortgage lender, when they put it in, it kept turning them down. It was turning them down because of the lack of the history. We added the authorized user, which retroed about 6 years worth of perfect history on there, and the system picked them up. And we see this happen all the time. So again, there is a time and place for everything. If your credit's already good, You don't need an authorized user. Don't worry about it. This would be more for somebody that's limited on time on bureau, limited on utilization in general as far as age, or their utilization is high. Now, an authorized user does not offset current utilization the same as if they had their own, say, $20,000 limit credit card versus an authorized user that's a $20,000 limit. It doesn't offset it dollar for dollar in the way it calculates that percentage the way a primary card would. However, it absolutely helps. All right. So hope that blesses you. We're going to dive in deeper on this stuff. We'll talk to you on the next one.